Alright, this is John Cola with GrowingYourGreens.com. Another exciting episode for you. I'm here on Oahu, Hawaii, just 5 miles from Waikiki Beach, but yet I haven't been to this the beach this trip because I'm out making videos for you guys. You know, we're 5 miles from Waikiki in downtown Honolulu, and the reason why I'm here today is I'm here to visit Kokua Worms. And this is a business that's on the second floor at 742 Queen Street here. And this is a place that you can buy worms in Hawaii. And for those of you guys that live in Hawaii, you're going to want to pay attention to this because it's very important. And for those of you guys that don't live in Hawaii, this episode is going to be really full of good information for you guys to learn about the worms, learn about how composting is really good, and learn about if you guys cook at home and have plants, you guys should be worm composting and making your own precious vermicast, one of the most nutritious things you can put in the garden. But more importantly, you know, take a chunk out of what you are throwing away, because when you throw things away, it really doesn't go away. It doesn't disappear. They don't send it into space. It goes into the landfill, it rots, creates methane gas. Really not a good thing. No better way to use your food scraps than to enrich your soil, or even if you don't have a garden, you know, create vermicastings and give to friends and neighbors to enrich their soil, or just throw it in the park when no one's looking. All right, so let's go ahead and head out to the second floor to Kokua Worms. So now I'm upstairs on the second floor at Kokua Worms, and they're only open by appointment only. So don't just come down, even though I gave you guys the address. You know, you want to give them a call first or email them to make sure they're going to be here when you come down. So yeah, once again, by appointment only. So now I'm going to go ahead and go inside. This is a fairly small office, but in this office, you know, space, they have many different things to help you compost with worms, including actually several different styles of systems that they're showing, and including 3 different types of worms. You guys know there's, you know, they have 3 different kinds of worms for sale, but there's many different kinds of worms, and these 3 unique varieties of worms are very good for your garden and also for breaking down the trash. So I guess maybe the first thing I want to do is show you guys the worms, because that's the reason why I'm here. And worms are part of your ecosystem in your garden, right? We want to have biologically alive soil, including bacteria, including microbes, including nematodes, including worms, including arthropods, and you know, all the different creatures that are down in the soil doing their job. And this is part of a biologic, organic gardening that I like to teach you guys, and worms are an essential part. I mean, if you set up your garden properly, yeah, some of the worms will come on their own and find a home in your nice environment that you're giving for them. But one of the things I really like to do is implant the worms and get some worms and just put them into my garden so that they could do their work. And if you provide a really good environment for them, guess what? They're gonna breed and multiply. I like breeding and multiplying, and so do the worms. So let's check out the worms breeding and multiplying today. Alright, so now I want to show you guys the different kinds of worms, and they got 3 different kinds of worms here. They got the composting worms, which are the kind that are going to basically break down your food scraps and turn them into nutrients for your garden. And one of the ones that's really common that many of you guys may know are known as the red wigglers, and those are in here. But besides just the red wigglers, they also have some Indian blues. And these are another kind of worm that are tropical worms, so you're not really going to want to get these if you live in Michigan, because they don't like freezing. But if you guys look there, you could see a whole bunch of the worms moving around. And the fast moving worms are the blues, and the slow moving worms are the reds. And you know, I recommend a diversity of worms in your garden if you live in a climate such as a tropical climate where you don't get freezes, you know, that'll support both these kinds. So it's best to always have a diversity, because what you're going to find is whether you're growing your worms outside in your raised bed garden or whether you have worms in a worm bin, you know, the conditions that you create for your worms are going to be more conducive to one or the other kind of worms, and one or the other kind of worms will, you know, dominate the bin. And you know, by having more varieties, that way you have higher chances of success. And if you are successful with your worms and they really like what you're doing, you know, they're also going to mate and lay eggs. So what I have here on this paper, I don't know if you guys are going to be able to see this. Let's see if I can put it in my hand there. I have some specks of dirt in there, but if you look very closely, you'll see some little worm eggs, and they look like almost clear little round balls, like almost like little bubbles, right? And those are worm eggs, and those will hatch into worms, you know, for your garden, and you could put them out in your garden, and they're going to basically reproduce and multiply, and then you'll be able to divide your worms, have another worm bin, and give them to friends. And that's really cool. So that's the composting worms that most people are familiar with. And the other kind of worm that I really want to show you guys today are these guys, you know. And I've always had these worms, and I've had the red wigglers in my garden, but I've had these other kind of worms in my garden that are kind of bigger and fatter and all this stuff. And I'm not a worm guy. I didn't go to school for wormology or whatever they call it. But I saw these guys, and I don't really know what they are until today, actually. Coming here, I learned something every place I go, and hopefully you guys are also learning something every place I go by watching my videos. But these guys are called amenthus, and these guys are actually these are not composting worms per se, but these are garden worms, and they're aeration worms. Very important. You know, they primarily like aerate your soil, makes aerating your soil that, you know, creates air channels that are good for the plant roots, that are good for the microbes down in there. And, you know, they might eat some kind of like wood, you know, shavings, pellets, and maybe even some coffee grounds. But they're not really, you know, around for composting food waste. So if you get these guys, and I would recommend you guys get these guys, if you don't have these guys, in addition to the red wigglers, take these guys and bury them out in your raised beds. I like to probably bury, like, I don't know, for a 4 foot by 4 foot raised bed, I'd probably bury, like, you know, a couple ounces in each bed to kind of give them a home. And if you're treating them well, they're going to breed and multiply and do all that aeration, which is especially important in a no-till gardening, like I recommend. So I guess the next thing I want to share with you guys is worm habitats for your reds or your blue worms. Alright, so now that you guys got to see the different kinds of worms, right, and you only want to put the reds and the blues in one of these worm habitats or worm homes, because the other kind, that's for putting out in your garden so you can do the aeration, you know, and all that kind of stuff. Very important, right? They will not survive in one of these habitats. Now, there's many different choices you guys can get for a worm habitat or simply a worm home. And I believe that by having a proper habitat and feeding them and treating your worms properly, they're going to thrive. And if you've had a worm habitat before and your worms didn't make it, that's because something probably went wrong. You know, you overfed them, you didn't have enough aeration, you know, maybe you're not giving them enough like grit, you know, because they need some grit to kind of clean themselves out, much like we need fiber. There's so many different things. I'm not the worm expert, but if you come down here, you're going to want to talk to Leslie, because she knows all there is to know about worms. She's like the worm expert that I got to learn from today. But they have many different worm habitats for your budget, and also more importantly for, you know, how much food waste you're generating, right? You don't want to get a huge worm bin if it's just you producing, you know, a little cup full of food, you know, waste, you know, every couple days, right? That's not going to work. You want to get, you know, your worm bin or your worm habitat sized properly. So yeah, talk to Leslie. She'll answer all your questions to get you sized properly when you come down here, you know, to the shop. But in general, what I'll tell you is this, you know, the less people you have in your household, the smaller your worm habitat's going to be. So for example, for like 1 or 2 people, you can see this one right here. And this is something you guys could even make at home if you don't want to, you know, if you're not handy with drills and going out and sourcing all the different components. I mean, literally it's just a little tote bin with holes drilled in the bottom, a couple things to bump this up off the bottom so it gets a good airflow. Once again, very important. And you're going to catch the stuff, the liquid that comes off the bottom, also known as the leachate. Very important. This is known as leachate or worm pee, or more specifically, actually, it's just it's what the composting or rotting food is just draining off. And you know, some people say it's good for gardening, some people say it's bad for gardening. You know, I tend to think that if you dilute it properly, you can just put it on stuff, but it's not any kind of major fertilizer, you know, that we're going to talk about actually in a little bit, you know, the vermicastings, and also the worm tea or compost tea that you can make with the vermicastings is much more important to your garden than just the leachate. So yeah, this is a smaller system, and one of the things that I learned about today was providing bedding for the worms. That's super important, out of a coconut coir and maybe like some shredded newspaper, and having a nice layer in there so that you can get some airflow in there, plus the worms like to live in this. And then you're going to basically do lasagna style worms. You're going to put in the bedding, then some food, and then some more bedding, and you're going to keep stacking it up on top. And one of the things I also learned today, very important, is don't feed your worms every day. I know we like to be fed multiple times a day, But you know, too much food in your worm system can overload the worms, and they're going to go, oh my gosh, there's too much food, I'm freaking out. And then you might lose your worms. So you could lose your worms for overfeeding, you could lose your worms for underfeeding, you could lose your worms for having too much water, and also if you overfeed, it's going to stink. And nobody wants a stinky worm bin, right? So if you had worm bins in the past and it stunk, you're probably overfeeding because the worms aren't able to digest food that quickly. You know, and in general, you know, you're going to also need to get the proper amount of worms to start with, right? If you're putting in a lot of food, you're going to need a lot more worms for them to digest the food. So it's very important to talk to somebody who knows, you know, how much, you know, worms you're going to need to put in. You know, for example, like in a big system like this, the Worm Cafe, you know, which is my favorite style system because it just makes things really easy. It drains out all the liquid on the bottom. You're going to need about 1 pound of worms to start with. And this is just not 1 pound of worms with the bedding. This is 1 pound of worms straight up, right? Because a lot of places will sell you worms and they'll say, oh yeah, 1 pound of worms, but it's 1 pound of worms with their bedding. And you know, I've bought worms like that before, you know, $39.95 or whatever. Went to a local lady, she gave me a whole bunch, and I like looked through there, I'm like, man, there's like 20 worms in here, man. I got ripped off. So it's much better and always better to buy worms by the ounce. And yeah, it's going to cost you guys more, but you really know what you're getting. You're getting live worms that are going to do the job of breaking down your food. And plus, you know, if you treat them properly, they're going to mate and make eggs, like I showed you guys earlier, and create more worms, you know, that then you can put out into your garden, give to friends, and even make more worm bins to compost other stuff, you know, through the vermiculture on your property. Because, you know, the reason why I like to compost with worms is because it's feeding them, it's removing a food source that I would need to get rid of that's not going to the landfill, but more importantly, I'm creating the really rich vermicastings, or the worm poop. And to me, as a gardener, that's the most important. I believe everybody out there should be using some worm castings in their gardening. It is quite essential. The other thing I want to mention, you guys, is that, you know, the worm castings that you produce are only as good as what you're feeding the worms. Super important, super critical. I learned this from George Hahn. I'll put a link to the video that I did with George, who basically makes worm castings on a commercial industrial level and sells the highest quality worm castings that I've found. You know, he feeds the worms things, you know, that are rich in cellulose, so like shredded cardboard or cardboard slurry, as well as things high in chitin. Very important to get some of those additives in there, you know, when you're feeding your worms. So yeah, these are some of the different systems. And oh, another thing very important that I learned today is when you're feeding, and you're only supposed to feed 2 to 3 times a week, right? That's it. I mean, I know you guys make food waste every day and don't feed your worms every day. You might want to take your food waste, you know, put it in a sealed container in your fridge, or a sealed container in the freezer. And then, you know, if it's in the freezer, take it out and thaw it out before you feed it to your worms. This will kill any kind of bugs and all this kind of stuff, fly larvae that may be in there. If you freeze it, pull it out, let it thaw out, and you're going to have, you know, more of a bug-free, you know, worm habitat. The other thing that's very important is you want to put the paper shreddings on top every time and have a nice layer, and don't like pack it on in there, man. I can pack more in there. You want to leave it nice and fluffy so that you can get some good airflow, because this is very important for the worms. Another thing that I learned, a tip about feeding, is when you're feeding, like say that you got a worm bin here and it's really long, you're going to want to feed like, you know, one day you're going to feed in the front half and put the shredded paper on top, and then you're going to wait a day or two, and then the next time you're going to feed in the second half. So now the worms have to keep traveling back and forth to get the food. And if you lift up the first half and, you know, it's almost fully gone, or you can see something's happening and it's not smelling, then it's a good time to add, you know, back to you know, feed them again. But if nothing's really happening right, don't overfeed your worms or put too much food scraps in your worm bin, because, you know, it's going to get stinky, and nobody likes a stinky worm bin, especially your wife or your husband in some cases. So yeah, they got basically a few designs of the worm habitats. They got the vertical design, which is the one I just showed you, the homemade version here, the Worm Cafe, as well as the Worm Hangout. And, you know, that's a flow-through design, which, you know, every different kind of worm habitat has its all pros and cons, and I'm not going to go over all the pros and cons in this video, but if you are in the Honolulu area, you want to come here and talk to Leslie, and she'll help you select the proper worm habitat for you so you can be optimally successful, letting worms digest your food, and more importantly, make the worm fertilizer. And that's what I really want to talk about next, because that's what drew me to come here today, is the worm fertilizer, or the vermicastings. And if you're a gardener here on Oahu, you could also come here and probably buy the best vermicastings on Oahu right here. So let me go ahead and show you guys what it looks like. So now what we're going to look at is the vermicastings, and what in my opinion, is one of the best nutrients or fertilizers, if you want to call that, for your garden. And that's the worm poop. I mean, worms would be in your ground naturally if there wasn't, topsoil degradation, there wasn't bulldozing, and there was naturally a lot of organic matter on your property. And they're in there to basically make nutrients for your plants, and this is how nature systems work, and this is what I'm trying to duplicate in my garden. And I know some of you guys actually don't have worms and you can't make your own, so that's why you can actually come here and get some really good vermicastings. And I want to let you guys know that vermicastings and even things like compost are a living product. There's a lot of different microbes and bacteria and all these different creatures living in the vermicastings, so they definitely need to be treated properly, right? I've gone to places where they just have piles of worm castings and they're sitting in open air and they're drying out, and this is not good. They should remain moist, so here they have a covering over it to retain some of the moisture that we're now going to go ahead and pull off to reveal some really nice black vermicastings. And I want to pick this up and show you guys. I mean, look at this stuff, man. This is nice and dark, rich vermicastings. And the main benefit of the vermicastings, and yes, it contains some nutrients in there, a little bit, but the main benefit is you're bringing in the biologic activity that may not be happening in your garden if you're not gardening in a microbial happy fashion, right? I like to use products like you guys saw previous in my series here on Oahu, like the EM1, and of course making your own compost. But vermicastings, super important, right? And you should add in some with your soil mixture when planting plants, especially when germinating new seedlings. I really like to put it with new seedlings, and even when transplanting, like if I have little pots that I bought, and I dig a little hole and I'm putting in my plant, I like to put in a handful of castings with a handful of rock dust, and those are my two main things I like to put in, that always have to go in. So besides just using the vermicastings, another thing that you can do with your vermicastings, if you don't have a lot of them, to extend them and make them go longer and basically brew your own biology, is the compost tea made with the vermicastings. And that's what they do here with their vermicastings and an activator solution. They brew their own compost tea. So let me go ahead and show you guys how they brew their compost tea and how you can make your very own compost tea at home as well. So what we're looking at now is the way that I recommend and every week, treat my garden to a bath and infusion of compost tea. I recommend you guys do it at home if you can, but if you're not able to, you could come to a place like we are at today, and you could buy high quality worm casting compost tea. And that's when I say compost tea, I don't mean just like compost out of thermophilic compost. I'm meaning using worm castings to make the compost tea. So they use their very own worm castings here. In addition, they use this compost tea catalyst, which provides other nutrients for the castings, and more importantly for the bacteria, so that they can multiply and breed, and you could have a rich tea full of some small levels of nutrients, but mostly biology that now you can spray all over your garden, on the plants and in the soil, to increase the biological activity. So now what's going to happen is you're going to basically speed up nutrient cycling in your garden, so your plants are going to grow more vigorously, they're going to be healthier, they're going to produce more delicious crops for you to eat, and of course there'll be greater pest and disease resistance as well. So yeah, come here to get your compost tea, or better yet, make your own with your own vermicastings. So the last thing I want to do in this episode is show you guys some books that are vital, for your success in gardening that they're offering here on Oahu. So they have a few books that I'd like to share with you guys. The first one is actually Worms Eat Our Garbage, and this is perfect if you have kids or you're a teacher and have a classroom and want to introduce, how worms work with your kids. So this is classroom activities for a better environment, worms that eat our garbage. Next is for you guys that are gardeners out there, and hopefully all you guys watching this episode are gardeners out there. Two very important books, Teeming with Nutrients and Teeming with Microbes. These are two books that I live by. These are two books that my whole gardening philosophy is based upon. It's basically by the food soil web of gardening, and worms play a very important role in the food soil web, and without them, the food soil web literally wouldn't work, because like if you take one piece out of a puzzle, right, it's not going to be complete, right? And worms are a big component of that puzzle. And I definitely recommend you guys get these books. Now you guys might be seeing over here on the second shelf, they got azimites, and yeah, you could buy the azimite here to put in your garden. It's a bit expensive to buy it in a 6-pound box, but the reason why they have the azimite as well as the worm farm and compost conditioner, it basically provides a mineral or something with grit to feed the worms. That's very important for them. You could also use something like eggshells, which may have salmonella contamination, so you're supposed to like leave those out for a period of time, and then grind them up in a coffee grinder, so that your worms could better digest them. So I'm glad that Kokua Worms here is in downtown Honolulu to serve all of Oahu, so that you could get your worms, get your vermicastings, and that I was able to make a episode today to show you guys the different kinds of worms and houses. And I want to hopefully encourage you guys, no matter where you live, to get a worm habitat today and start farming your worms, but more importantly, get some of those aeration worms and get those in your garden as soon as possible. If you want to learn more about the shop here, you want to visit them at kokuaworms.com. Hopefully you guys enjoyed this episode. Once again, my name is John Kohler with growingyourgreens.com. We'll see you next time, and until then, remember, keep on growing. All right, this is John Kohler with growingyourgreens.com. Today we have another exciting episode for you, and I'm on the island of Oahu, and I'm visiting a farm. I love visiting farms, and if you guys have never visited a farm, you guys should totally visit a farm. And actually, this is a farm you can visit. This is a Green Rose Farm here on Oahu in Waimanalo.